In this tutorial, I'm going to look at bringing in some other information. There's a couple of sources that are useful also um, for us to work on Canberra, but more broadly might be useful to others. But let's start with the ones we're going to use. So Aurin is a research network that brings together a whole lot of data. Open, Open Streetmap, other university data, urban data. And it's available really as a resource for people to utilize, as they say, for spatial data analytics. Now, if we go to data catalog, the first thing to be aware of is we have to manage access to get into it. And as a staff member at an academic at a university, if you log in through your university access, you'll generally find something there, and potentially as a student, I'm not entirely sure. By going to my account, you can log in. If I go to data sets here, what I want to find now is building outlines. Now, if I go to building outlines, oops, actually there. So building outlines, what we see is that, we can really clearly see how there's that resource there that from OpenStreetMap. Now, just to be aware, OpenStreetMap has 3D of some places. And so, for example, if I'm in Canberra here, this is the resource, and we can see that it's three-dimensional. That's very handy for some operations to take into Blender or Rhino or Grasshopper, etc. But in a way, we want them as 2D polylines as well. You can see how much is missing here, and obviously this is done through compiling stuff from various sources. And citizen data collection, if you're a procrastinator, perhaps sketching in the areas that are missing from your area is like a contribution to this resource. So we can see that these areas are actually in 3D. So the data set from Aurin has them already extracted. And so if I go to that outline there, you'll see it's giving me there, and I can download this data set. So I've done that. You would go through that process. I'm not going to record that, but that's, one would download that. If we do it, I will go to where it says download just to see what they're talking about, because you can see the format is GeoJSON. Now, that's handleable by QGIS, so you would download that. So that gives us a really big body of data. So if we go to, I'm going to jump to QGIS for a moment to show you how big it is. If we turn it on and then we choose to zoom right out, you'll see, it's giving you the whole of Australia. It's about a 500 meg file. So lots of data in there. So one of the first things and what we're going to do in this tutorial is we're going to look at how you would simplify it down to be able to actually get something out of it that's utilizable for a specific area, considering there's so much of it. You'll notice to zoom to the extent, I went to this button out here, zoom full, but if we actually right click on that layer and say zoom to layer, it will do the same thing and give you the extent of that layer. So in a way we can see, how do I get the ACT? How do I work that out? So if I go to the ACT's Open Data Portal, we can see a whole lot of information. And one of the things that's really useful to see is this geospatial catalog. So if I go to there, what we'll see is there's a whole lot of data here. Now, what I'm specifically looking for is actually the ACT boundary, because then what I can do is I can extract the material that's relevant just to the ACT. Now, I don't know exactly where that is, but let's try and say border and see what we can find in that situation. And then we can see it, ACT government border. If I click on it, we can see that it's a very small file when it eventually comes its way. And so what we're really going to be looking at here, you can see, it says, here's the details. Now, if you look at this, it's worth noting, at the top here, it says open data. I'm going to look at the web address, opendata.arcgis.com. And so this is where we see that ultimately what's happening is that ArcGIS is hosting the ACT's data and using ArcGIS online to display it. So it's a simple file, this one. It's just actually a outline. Now, if we download it, we click on it, we'll see, as it comes up, there's a number of formats. Shapefile is pretty common. We could be using, a geo database just as easily. I've been using that in other places, but in this instance, we can download a shapefile, which I've already done. So let's now go back to QGIS. Now, obviously, we talk, a lot of this whole thing runs from the browser. So if we go here, we can see that that I've got information here on different sort of areas. And if I go to Canberra, and then I go to my ACT data spatial geospatial data catalog, you see I've got, ACT government border. If I get on the shapefile .shp and I drop it in here, then, if I zoom in, if I click on that, you can see that little thing there. If I click on that layer and then I say zoom to layer, we get here. And I mean, obviously in the background, it looks really weird because we've got all of this faded out stuff, and that's because there's actually a lot of data and it doesn't want to show us at all. So let's actually just turn this off for a second and just zoom in a bit further and see what we've really got in here. And it does, from my experience, take a bit of time to regenerate. And so, we may not see it immediately as we get in here. We can see it's working to display it. Let's see if it gives it to us. It does give it to us eventually in that situation. And so because I'm recording, I'm not going to wait. So instead, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to, you have to take my word for it that it's there. I'm going to zoom to the layer. And I've zoomed to the layer of the border, right? Or if I zoom to the layer of the whole country, let's have a look. Oh yeah, there's the buildings. You can see them there, right? Now, I've told that layer border is turned off. I'll turn it back on. Now, I should note that when it comes in at the first time, it's going to ask you to convert it. Because I've already done it, it's going to say, what do you want to do with these two mapping systems? And I just chose the default. And let's first of all see how that default works in terms of that mapping system and hope that it works well. So we've got the ACT border there. We know from our symbology tutorial that if I click here and say transparent fill, then we end up with with that outline. And so what I'm ultimately going to do is I'm going to clip out the bit of data that just relates to the ACT. Now, you'll note there's a lot more in the ACT that's showing here. As I said, it's a citizen science thing, and so there's stuff missing. It's potentially because of the fact that that where people haven't done that yet, or that there was data sources that were not available. That's an ongoing project where we might actually choose to do that. So when I say clip, this is where we go to another sort of operation. And so the operation we're now looking at was working on the top menu here. We can see that there's a range of things, and one of them is vector. Vector data is this polygon data. So if I go to vector here and I go to geoprocessing tools, well, there's a number of things we may or not go through in this tutorials, but let's look at the first one here, which is geoprocessing tools. And let's then go to clip, because that's what I want to do. I want to clip out those bits of data that are relevant to the ACT. So I go to clip, and what it wants to know is what's your input layer and what's your overlay layer. So input layer is the layer that's got the stuff you want to clip from. And so what I'm going to do is I want that OpenStreetMap data. And when it says what's the overlay layer, the overlay layer is this ACT government border. And so I'm going to click on that. Then it wants to know what to do with it. Well, it says, do we want to, where do we want to put the clipped file? I could save it, or I can create a temporary layer to look at it, and let's do that. So I'm going to run that, and we'll see how it goes. These things can be complex, and so I'm just going to potentially pause the recording for a moment, just until we actually until we know how that runs. So we can see now is that activity has happened, and we can see in the layer here that it's clipped. Now we've got all the data, so let's just see really what it looks like. So if I turn off that layer, then you can see how just those bits that were there inside that clip boundary on the border are available. And so now what I can do is I'm going to turn that layer off. When it says clipped here, I'm going to choose to save it. This is a useful exercise to understand how to save things as well. So if I say, when I go here, I say export, save features, then what I'm going to save it as is if I go there, let's just look at it. it says format Esri shapefile. Now, when you look here, you see a lot of information, right? There's an AutoCAD DXF. That means you could take that data into AutoCAD because AutoCAD accepts a DXF, Revit accepts a DXF, Illustrator accepts a DXF. So that's really useful. But we're going to stick with an Esri shapefile. What I'm going to call it OSM ACT. This data is from 2021. So, old school, you would put a lower, an underscore there for spaces in case it has to have a geoprocessing things. And it wants to know what the layer is. And so I want a layer name in. I'm actually going to just also choose to save it in that location that I was talking about. GIS. We'll go to Canberra. And then I've got, I'm actually going to change it to say OSM building outlines. Put it there. So it's got a lot of other information there. Let's just press, and it says add saved file to map. That's handy. So I go, okay. And there we see it's there. Now, at this point, I can then choose to, I've got this one turned off. I'm actually going to remove it, remove that layer because we don't need the big one because we've got the small one now. Okay. I'm also going to remove the clipped one, the temporary one, because we really don't need that anymore because we've got the permanent one. Where are we? So there are our building outlines. So that's an example of how a few things. One is how we can get information in, how we can get the information from a number of data sources, how we can clip it to a boundary that's useful to us, how we can sort of save things as well. And that's data that we'll be utilizing.